mentioned Ava Bartlett, who was on our show a
Yeah.
couple weeks ago. Because you are a colleague and a friend of Ava's, I wanted to ask you what's really been stunning to me is the Western media, except for doing a hit piece on Ava, has not mentioned that she is on a kill list for the Ukrainian military. And this kill list is from a website that the US State Department had deemed a terrorist organization. And yet, because it's done by the Ukrainian military, and she's one of the journalists on this list, I mean, it's just amazing to me. She's a Canadian, also has an American passport, that they're not doing anything to talk about this journalist at risk, but rather just ignoring it and then smearing her. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we go back to 2014 and we remember what was very probably the assassination of Serena Shim, who again was a US citizen working for Press TV and exposing the influx of terrorists through the Turkish border into Syria, but on not only terrorists, but also chemical weapon ingredients, weapons, etc. And she was killed after she broadcast that she was frightened for her life. She was killed while driving on Turkish roads by a mysterious lorry that just happened to hit the car. Now, she was a US citizen, and her killing was barely mentioned in the US, and it hasn't been covered since she was killed. And you know that speaks volumes. Look for example at Alina Lip, right, a German journalist reporting like Eva from Donbass. So she's a journalist. She's, if you like, she's embedded in Donbass, but she's reporting on what she's seeing. The German government has not only closed her bank account, but closed the bank account of her father. And if she goes back to Germany, she's threatened with 3 years imprisonment because it's perceived that she's supporting the Russian invasion. And in the paperwork they sent to her, they told her to not even come to the prosecution hearing or whatever it was, because effectively she's irrelevant to the case and her evidence is irrelevant to the case. So, I mean, this is the level of democracy we now have in the West. I mean, not even speaking about Julian Assange and all of the other dissidents. And there are actually many in the UK who are effectively being isolated, which is a form of torture, because they challenge the establishment, right? Not necessarily politically, but maybe in other spheres, right? Maybe they spoke about the aged care homes and things like that, or even the treatment of children in foster homes, the disappearance of children, etc., right? So they are dissidents in different spheres, but they are still being punished for actually challenging power. And this is where we're at now. You know, you mentioned the media. The media, in my opinion, is nothing more than a hitman for power now. Yeah. It's ceased to be anything other than this, right? It doesn't. I was reading a number of reports today, and it is literally, if you imagine all mainstream media take their bylines from Reuters, Associated Press, right? Those are the dominant news producers, and it's from that the Guardian and CNN and so on take their lead. When you look at what Reuters and AP are producing, they're just really running banners for foreign policy, right?
Yeah, talking points.
Yeah, you know, they'll just reproduce. For example, today there was Ambassador Burns in China was calling out China for, I mean, it kind of made me laugh, but it's so disgusting. Calling out China for supporting Russian propaganda in Ukraine, right? And heaven forbid saying that there were chemical labs in Ukraine. Well, yeah, there were. Victoria Nuland has actually admitted it. And saying that it was NATO expansion that led to the Russian special operation. Well, yeah. I mean, even John Mearsheimer and various other kind of high-level analysts have actually concurred with that conclusion, right? And here's this guy calling out China in China and saying, like, stop supporting Russian lies, support US lies instead, because they're real lies, right?
Right.
And, you know, organized media outlets like Bloomberg are just literally printing word for word what he said.
Right.
That's it. So there's no balance. There's no comment from any of the Chinese officials who were actually there. There's no historical comments from members of the Chinese government who have been very clear in their interpretation of events in Ukraine.
No,
so this is, you know, yeah, it's insane.
It is, and I mean the murder of Shireen by you know, because you had been to Palestine. Had you met Shireen when you were there?
No, I hadn't, because unlike Eva, who was in, she went to the occupied territories, I think in 2008, 2009. Could be wrong, and Eva can kill me if I am. I went to Gaza in 2012. I haven't actually visited the occupied territories, and by that time it would be quite unlikely that someone like myself or Eva would be allowed to enter. I'm pretty certain Eva was banned after one of her last trips from the occupied territory, so she was banned by Israel. And you know, I even had problems entering from the Egyptian side, because Israel still controls, Israeli intelligence, Mossad still control who enters Gaza, even from the Egyptian side, right? So no, I hadn't met her, but I did an RT interview very quickly today about this insane finding that the bullet was too destroyed for them to carry out forensic analysis, etc., and that they've concluded that this was an accidental shooting. And, you know, I pointed out to RT, how can it be accidental when she's wearing a bullet vest, when she's wearing a helmet, and they managed to shoot her in the head? That's precision
underneath. Yeah, that's a precision.
You know. So it's a cover-up.
Well, definitely. I mean, the State Department's came out with that report that it looked like they were just bending over into pretzels trying to give a narrative that would please Israel. You know, like I think one of the most ridiculous headlines I saw regarding this was a bullet finds a journalist. I mean, how does a bullet find what does that even mean? Like that? I mean, that's someone who took creative writing in that at that point. And, you know, and over here, a lot of times when we are critiquing the sort of the corporate media, we refer to the Western corporate journalists like CNN and CSNBC as Western stenographers. And we call them stenographers because it feels like that's all they're doing. They're just copying down what the government wants them to say. And it's very frustrating as a Western citizen living, because you have now, especially since they've censored RT, there's no view other than through the Western lens, and that's a very myopic, skewed lens right now.
Well, I mean, they've also severely degraded discourse, because they've kind of fostered a debate arena where people are so gladiatorial. I mean, this began pre-Syria, but Syria really enforced this, right? Where if you want to have a nuanced discussion, you're immediately accused of either being an Assadist on one side or being an imperialist on the other. And there's no middle ground. There's no middle ground where you can say, well, hang on, I'm anti-imperialist, but I can still call out, I can still critic some of the actions of the government I'm defending, but you don't even get to that point, because before you can get to that point where you can have this kind of nuanced, intelligent, analysis-based discussion, you're shot down and you end up defending yourself from these ridiculous attacks.
Yeah, I've noticed,
and therefore it never gets any further.